Male Texans between the ages of 18 and 24 litter. They throw their trash out their truck windows, not cars, because they don't drive cars. They drive trucks. And they throw the trash out the window, and it litters the highways and byways of the state of Texas. And the state of Texas spent millions of dollars with signs about not littering the highway and signs about fines if you litter and taking people to court and making them pay the fines and so on and so forth. And it did no good to clean up the litter problem. And then they got Dallas Cowboys to crush beer cans with their hands and say, "Don't mess with Texas." And the problem was fixed. As a matter of fact, in 2006, Americans voted "Don't mess with Texas" that year's most popular saying. And there was a parade in New York for the saying, for the phrase, "Don't mess with Texas" on Madison Avenue. As somebody said, only in America. 72, and here's the deal, 72% cleaner along the Texan highways. 72%. Fix the problem. Sometimes people need a nudge before they'll do basically anything. Sometimes we need a nudge for everything that we do. And the best nudge in the world is that somebody else is doing it. If I tell you only 25% of the people vote in this country, if I say 30%, I say get out and vote, you won't listen to it. But if I say, hey, I voted today, I'm voting tomorrow, all the people in my neighborhood are voting, we're all voting, you'll go, hey, maybe I should get out and vote. We only do what other people are doing. Sometimes God nudges the whole human race. I counted, by my count, 7 times in the Bible where God did something, an act of God, that affected the whole human race right then, instantly, at that moment. 7 times. Now, there's a lot of miracles in the Bible. There's a lot of acts of God. But most of them just affected one person or two person or a nation of people. Even Jesus dying on the cross, the only people who knew about it were the people that were there for the most part. Even the day of Pentecost was the people in the city of Jerusalem. Although it spread throughout the world, it wasn't at that particular moment. So let's count these miracles. First, on the 6th day, God created Adam and Eve. Did that affect the whole human race? You bet. It affected profoundly those two, Adam and Eve. Okay. God ejected Adam and Eve from paradise. Once again, still there in, chapter 3 or 4 of Genesis. Whole human race affected. God flooded the earth and destroyed it, all except 8 people who were saved in the ark. That affected those 8 people, and it very, very much affected all the rest. Correct? Am I right so far? Okay, here's a maybe. Elijah prayed that it would not rain, and there was no rain or dew on the ground for 3 years. Now, was that local? I don't know how local that could be. No rain or dew. Extreme drought throughout the whole, I would say, probably the whole area where man lived at the time. So that's a maybe. The sun and moon stood still, Joshua chapter 10, for 24 hours, almost a whole day. In other words, the earth did not revolve. Technically, the heavens did not revolve. They stopped moving. The sun and the moon stood still for a whole day. Did that affect the whole human race? Absolutely. If the sun was still shining out right now, outside, not that it was shining when I came, but let's theoretically, if it was light out, and it was still light out when we left, and we went home and we got ready to go to bed at 10 o'clock tonight, and it was still light out, and then at 1 o'clock in the morning it was still light out, would that affect the whole world? Sure. Matthew, Mark, and Luke report that from noon until 3 o'clock there was darkness over the face of the earth when Jesus was crucified. Jesus was crucified at 9 a.m. approximately, and from 9 until noon it was light, and from noon until 3 when he died it was not light. It was dark. This was not a solar eclipse. How do we know that it was not a solar eclipse? For one thing, the maximum a total eclipse can last is 7 minutes. The longest recorded one is 6 minutes and 39 seconds. I mean, obviously, if the moon is moving in front of the sun, the moon moves out from in front of the sun. 7 minutes is the absolute maximum. But we know it wasn't a solar eclipse from another reason. The Passover is always on the full moon. The moon was on the other side of the earth. Solar eclipse only happens when there's a new moon. So it could have been the sun eclipsed by something, but it wasn't the moon. And guess what? The stars were out. So in those movies where you see Jesus on the cross and there's all these clouds, rolling dark clouds that are blocking out the sun, that's not what happened. They saw the stars. It was night. Something was in front of the sun's light, but it did not block the stars' light. So it was not clouds. Amos, chapter 8, predicts that darkness. And in Matthew, let's turn over to Matthew, chapter 27. Here's what we read. Matthew 27, beginning in verse 46. Down through 52. About 3 in the afternoon, this is the end of the darkness, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near there heard this, they said, he is calling Elijah. Immediately, one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on his staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. This was night now. Now think about this for a minute. It's still dark. And inside the temple, in the Holy of Holies, in the holy place, the curtain separating the holy from the holies. I don't know if there was a lit candle in there. There was probably nobody in there to see this happen. And it was dark. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. It does not say whether the earth shaking affected the whole earth, but it could have. It does not say whether the people coming out of the tombs affected more than just the city of Jerusalem, but it could have. But the darkness affected the whole earth. In Psalm 22, that's what Jesus quoted. Let's turn over to Psalm 22. All of Psalm 22 is about Jesus on the cross. It starts out in verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? If we read down through Psalm 22, we would see him say, they pierced my hands and my feet. The whole psalm is about Jesus on the cross. And look at verse 2. My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. By night. And yet Jesus was taken down from the cross at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. This is a prediction of that darkness that would cover the earth from noon until 3. Historians have written about that darkness. We have it in secular history. Julius Africanus quotes the first century Greek historian Phlegon, which I mentioned this morning, of Tralles, as writing, during the time of Tiberius Caesar, an eclipse of the sun occurred during the full moon. In other words, it wasn't the moon that went in front of the sun, but during that time, there was an eclipse of the sun, and the moon was on the other side of the earth. That's what he wrote. Something eclipsed the sun, but it was not the moon. He actually wrote this. In the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, there was a great eclipse of the sun, greater than had ever been known before. For at the 6th hour of the day was changed into night, and the stars were seen in the heavens. An earthquake occurred in Bithynia and overthrew a great part of the city of Nicaea. And that's how we know that Jesus was crucified on April 1st, 33 AD, because of what that historian wrote. Now, we didn't have the Roman calendar, but if it was the Julian calendar, it would be the 3rd of April, but it doesn't matter. We know from that putting that together with the fact that there was that eclipse. And we know exactly when the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad was, you see, and what month it was in. And we know when the Passover was. But this sermon isn't about that. Remember I said 7? That was only 6. So, what's the 7th one? Old Testament. Give me a clue. Old Testament. Go ahead and blurt it out. You've studied it over and over and over again. It affected the whole human race. Old Testament. No. It will. It will. Anybody? If I say it, you'll know it. I mean, if I say it, you'll go, oh, of course. We already mentioned the flood. That was number 3. Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel. Okay. The tower didn't have much to do with the Tower of Babel, by the way. And I'll just throw this out here right now. Is Babel Babylon? Okay, so I read this very, very long article about whether Babel is Babylon. And let me tell you what the article said. It quoted everybody who's ever studied since the beginning of time whether Babel is Babylon or vice versa. Yes, no, yes, definitely, probably not, maybe, probably not, we don't know. And that's basically the end of that. Nobody knows. But it could have been, possibly. Let's go back, though, to the day man was created, Genesis 1. Let's turn over to Genesis, because we're going to be in Genesis for most of the rest of this. And let's start out exactly with Genesis 1, starting in verse 26, and let's read. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. That is the first commandment. He gave that commandment to Adam and Eve on the very day that he created them. He also told them on that day not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But he told them this first. That is the very first commandment in the Bible. Then God said, I give to you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit in it, fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. I just wanted to read that down there so you know that this is all in one day. This is one day, 6th day. Okay? So, let's turn over to chapter 2 and verse 19, because chapter 2 is all about the 6th day. So, chapter 1 is day 1 through 6, and on the 7th day rested. And then in chapter 2, it gives details about the 6th day. In verse 19, it says, Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals on that very day, and all the birds in the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds of the air, birds in the air, and all the wild animals. But for Adam no suitable helper was found. So the Lord caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. The man said, This is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. And she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. So he named woman as well. So Adam, on the very day that he was created, had language. A whole language. You can call it the language of God, or you can call it the language of man. But Adam was born with language in his brain. Because before Eve was even created, he named all of the animals. He took the language God had given him and he expanded it. How many animals was that? I don't know. Let's just say 200. Let's just say. Okay? That's 200 new words. And he still remembered him on day 7. So he had language, the language of God, and he was able to expand that language. And then he made up a new word, woman, because she was taken out of man. See how smart he is? Adam did more in the half day than I do in a year. That's how smart Adam was. He was a genius, I tell you. Okay, so now, fast forward 2,000 years to the flood, right after the flood. The question is, was it the same language? Well, we don't know, because it only skips a few chapters in Genesis, and now Noah had a language, his sons, his wives, the people around him had a language. Was that the same language? Well, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But one thing is for sure, and how many languages did Noah know? We don't know. But one thing is for certain, when they got off the boat, the ark, they had a language. And it was the language that they used every day, and it was one language. And they had children. Their sons and their sons' wives had children, and their children had children, and they were all still speaking that one language. Probably, I'm just guessing, we don't read anything otherwise, probably that very language that God had put into the mind of Adam when he created him. So now, let's turn to chapter 9 of Genesis, and let's read the first 7 verses. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." Look at that. That very same first commandment that he had given to Adam, he now gives to Noah and his sons right after they get off the boat. This is obviously something that's important to God. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the sky and every creature that moves along the ground and on all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you, just as I have given the green plants. I now give you everything. But you must not eat meat that has the lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. And as for you, he's going to say it again. He's going to reiterate himself. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. He gave the command to Adam and Eve. Then he destroyed all of mankind except for a few. And then he gave the command immediately to them again. In chapter 2, let's read on a little bit. We're going to learn about Nimrod. Okay, he was a leader at the time. He built cities. He was a mighty hunter. We're going to read that as well. Let's turn over to chapter 10 and read verses 1 through 5. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus. The sons of Gomer: Ashkenaz, Riphath, Togarmah. The sons of Javan: Elisha, Tarshish, the Kittites, and the Rodanites. From these, the maritime peoples spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. This is before the Tower of Babel. Okay, does that make sense? They're going through the genealogies now, but they're going to get to the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. But right now they're talking about, this first 300 or 400 years here. So their languages. Then when we get down to the sons of Ham, starting in verse 6, Cush, Egypt, Put, Canaan, the sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, Sabteca, the sons of Rama, Sheba, and Dedan. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, Calneh, in Shinar. Now, Shinar, I'll just stop there for just a second. This plain of Shinar, which we're going to read, is a region. It really means two rivers, probably the Tigris and Euphrates. It's not a city, it's not a place, it's a region, if you will. And it's mentioned all throughout the Bible. in various other places. So a region. So he built Babylon initially. And seeing that Nebuchadnezzar built Babylon later, so to speak, then perhaps, and because Nimrod built Babel, well, you see how we might think that Babylon and Babel are the same place? And then it goes on to say, from that land he went to Assyria. This is after the Tower of Babel, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin, and then, which is between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city. Egypt was the father of the Ludites, Anamites, etc., etc., etc. Skipping down, later the Canaanite clan scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon toward Gerar, as far as Gaza, and toward Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham and their clans and languages and their territories and nations. And if we went to read about Shem, if you jump down to verse 31, it says, these are the sons of Shem by their clans and languages and their territories and nations. So you see, one language, but then later, languages. Each family had, each of the descendants of the three sons had multiple languages. So, now, if we go over to chapter 11 and read verse 1. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. So this is before the Tower of Babel, and there was one language. And then we just read after the Tower of Babel, and there's going to be lots and lots of languages. Then verse 2, as people moved eastward, they found the plain of Shinar and settled there. Now what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is they just disobeyed God, who told them not to settle, so to speak. He said, don't settle. Keep moving. Cover the whole earth. Go to the four winds. But you know what happened? They were traveling along east, and here's the region of Shinar between the Tigris and Euphrates, and guess what? It's a good place. And when you come into a valley that's a good place, what do? Hey, looks like home. Well, they didn't stop there. Let's read on a little bit here. Verse 3. They said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. And then they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Now they're actually saying, I don't care what God's plan is, we're not going to be scattered. And if we work together to make a place for ourselves right here on this plain and build the right cities and build the right walls and build the right houses, we can just stay here and have the good life. Well, God didn't like that. And so here's what he says. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other. And that's what he did, and we'll read that in just a minute. But you know, we sometimes say God is not a God of confusion. Well, that's not exactly true. 1 Corinthians 14:33 says God is not a God of disorder, but it was originally translated confusion. God is not a God of disorder. He likes order. He also likes obedience. Is he a God of confusion? Well, yeah. It just said that. He confused them. Moreover, he confuses their enemies over and over again throughout the Old Testament. I mean, they run and all scattered in different directions, and they get slaughtered, basically, by the Israelites because God confuses them over and over again on behalf of the Israelites. But it goes on to say, so the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, which means confusion, or sounds like confusion, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world, From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Let's talk about how this might have looked. They woke up that day, or maybe it happened at midday, I don't know, but immediately they could not communicate. I don't know if the words were gone from their brain. Maybe they were. Obviously, they had the capability for language. They just didn't have any capability for the language that they had had when they woke up that day. I don't know if they tried to speak and the words would not come out of their mouth. Any of the words of the animals that Adam had named, any of the words that Adam had used to communicate with God and with Eve, and any of the words that they had used to build the ark, words would not come out of them. But they had the capability for language, and they quickly, very rapidly, developed language. They had to survive. If you and I couldn't talk to each other suddenly one minute, if no words would come out of our mouth, would we be able to communicate? Yeah, I mean, I do it all the time when I go to foreign countries and don't speak a word of the language. I communicate. I'm not going to starve to death. It's like, food. I need food, yes. But think about it for a minute. If we lived in a small community and we're a family together here, or a little cluster of families living together, we would rapidly develop a way to communicate. And ultimately, we would want to know if what was going on in our town, our space, was happening in the next space over, the next community over. And we would go over there at some point, maybe that day, maybe the next day, maybe a week later, and we would find out they're just as confused as we are. And we'd quickly realize that the whole country is confused. And then we would come back home and we would develop our own little language, but unfortunately that wouldn't be the language of our neighbors, and we'd quickly learn that although we could communicate with one another, we couldn't communicate with them. And you know what happens when you can communicate between yourselves and you can't communicate with your neighbors? You start to distrust them. And when things are not going well and productivity is real low and there's a lack of resources, you start to think, maybe they're going to come over here and take what we've got. And we better get out of here while the getting's good. Well, however it went down, they got out of there while the getting was good. And someone went to the sea and became fishermen and settled along the sea, and someone went south and some of them went north. And they kept on going, and they covered the whole world. Anyone who does not do the Lord's work will be disciplined. That's the point of me telling you this story. Do it now or suffer the consequences. Let's look in Matthew 21. Let's read a few verses from Matthew before we wrap it up. In Matthew 21, verses 28 through 31, we read the following. What do you think? There was a man who had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, Son, go and work today in the vineyard. I will not, he answered. But later he changed his mind and went. Then the father went to the other son and said the same thing. He answered, I will, sir, but he did not go. Which of the 2 did what his father wanted? Jesus is trying to prove a point here. He's saying, all that really matters in the end is that you do what God told you to do. Repeatedly, Jesus tells us to do this. Love one another. He tells us over and over again that love is the culmination, love for God and love for your neighbor is the culmination of all the laws and prophets. But he also tells us something else. Let's turn over to Mark. I said we were going to stay in Matthew, but we're not going to go over Mark for a minute. Mark 16. So, Mark 16, verses 15 and 16, he said this. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Doesn't that sound a lot like that be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth? Only now it's a message that we're taking into all the world, not man. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. The Great Commission is what we call it. Now, you might believe that only applied to them and doesn't apply to you. You might believe that it does apply to you and applies to all Christians. You might be doing it, and you might not be doing it. But know this. God knows whether you're doing it or not doing it. So if you believe that you should be doing it, then we should be doing it. Right? Just like those people who wanted to stay there on the plain of Shinar. Let's turn back to Matthew for a minute, chapter 10. This is our last verse. Matthew 10, starting at verse 32. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Some people like their comfy life. They like their comfy congregation. They like their comfy home. They like their comfy country. And they want to keep it just that way. They want their walls, their tower, and their safety net to make sure that everything stays in place because I've got my life just the way I want it. Nothing wrong with that, as long as we also are being obedient to God. If we're avoiding the work of God, then my guess is that Christ will come down and shake up our lives and scatter us, because we won't be of any value to him.